The search for Elias Whitfield ended before winter did. His dog never accepted that. By February, people had stopped looking for the boy and started wondering why the dog still waited beside the frozen creek. Elias Whitfield was 12 years old that winter, the only child of a widowed father who farmed a modest stretch of bottomland a half-mile from the water. He was a quiet boy, the kind neighbors described as old for his age without quite meaning it as a compliment or a complaint, responsible in a way that came more from necessity than temperament. Since his mother had died of childbed fever when he was 6, and there had been no one else to help his father keep the place running since. He'd taken to trapping and fishing early, the way boys in that country often did, and by 12 he ran a short line of traps along the creek bottom most mornings before school and most afternoons after, checking for muskrat and mink with a competence that made grown men nod approvingly when they heard about it. His father had taught him the line, the same line his own father had run before him, and Elias walked it now with an ease that suggested he could have done it blind. Every bend of the creek and every snag of brush as familiar to him as his own yard. His father, a man named Aaron Whitfield, had raised the boy largely alone after his wife's death, a practical man, shaped by years of hard farming and as someone who showed his care more through steady provision than through soft words. What softness there was in that household, neighbors sometimes said, came mostly from the dog. He never walked it alone, not in the sense the word usually meant. Ranger went with him every time, a rangy, brown and white hound of uncertain breeding that Elias had raised from a pup his father brought home the spring after his mother died, half as a gift and half, his father admitted later, because a boy who'd just lost his mother needed something of his own to look after. The dog had grown alongside him, learned the trap line alongside him, and by the time Elias was 12, the two of them moved through that creek bottom less like a boy and his dog than like two halves of the same animal, each one always somewhere close to the other, neither quite easy without it. A neighbor woman who saw them most mornings on her own way to the spring house said she could set her morning by the two of them passing her fence line, the boy walking steady and purposeful with his trap sack over one shoulder, the dog ranging ahead and circling back, ahead and circling back. She'd wave. The boy would wave back, and the two of them would carry on down toward the water without breaking stride. Nobody in the valley ever saw one without the other. The storm came on hard and fast, the way late winter storms sometimes did in that country, catching even people who'd lived there their whole lives off guard. It started as rain in the late morning, turned to sleet by noon, and by the time real cold settled in that evening the whole valley had gone to ice. Every branch and fence rail and blade of dead grass coated thick and glittering and treacherous. Elias had left that morning before the rain turned, same as any other day, headed down to check the trap line with Ranger at his heels. His father hadn't thought twice about it. The boy had walked that line in worse weather than a little rain, and there was no reason that morning to expect anything different. He'd watched the two of them head off down the lane from the porch, the way he did most mornings, and gone back inside his own chores without a second thought. By mid-afternoon, with the sleet turning harder and the temperature dropping fast enough that Aaron could feel it through the cabin walls, a small worry had started working at him. Though he told himself it was nothing, the boy knew to find shelter if the weather turned bad enough, knew the creek bottom and its hollows and overhangs well enough to wait out a storm if he had to rather than risk the walk home in ice. He kept at his own work, checking the window more often than he meant to as the light began to fail early under the heavy gray sky. He didn't come home for supper. His father waited an hour past the usual time before real worry set in, and by full dark, with the ice storm howling outside and no sign of either boy or dog, he was out the door himself with a lantern, calling Elias's name into a wind that swallowed the sound almost before it left his mouth. He found Ranger first, a little before midnight, soaked through and shivering at the edge of the creek bottom, alone. The dog had no trouble being found. He came when called, the way he always did, but he wouldn't leave that stretch of creek bank, circling back to it again and again no matter how many times Elias's father tried to lead him toward home. There was no sign of Elias anywhere near where the dog had been waiting. Aaron Whitfield spent what remained of that night searching the bank himself, lantern held high against a wind that kept threatening to snuff it, calling his son's name until his voice had gone hoarse and the cold had worked all the way through his coat. Ranger stayed close beside him through it, no longer trying to pull away, as though some change had come over the dog the moment Elias's father arrived, as though the search, once another person had joined it, had become something the dog could trust to be done properly, rather than something he had to manage entirely on his own. Aaron carried that detail with him afterward, turning it over in quieter moments. But the dog's frantic circling had stopped the instant help arrived, and had not resumed again with that same desperate edge for the rest of that long night. The search began in earnest at first light, with half the valley turning out despite the weather, men and a few of the older boys spreading out along both banks of the creek with whatever tracking skill they had between them. The ice made everything slower and harder to read. Tracks that might have told a clear story in ordinary snow were instead half erased, smeared by sleet, and were frozen overnight into shapes that could mean almost anything. What they found, eventually, working their way down from where Ranger had been waiting, was a single set of boy-sized tracks heading out onto the frozen creek itself, crossing toward the far bank where the ice ran thick over a wide, shallow stretch that had held weight safely for as long as anyone could remember. The tracks crossed, and then, on the far side, in a stretch of ground scoured nearly bare by wind and ice, they simply stopped. No tracks led away from where the boys' trail ended. No broken ice marked a fall through to the water below. The men checked that first and most carefully, working along the bank for any sign of a break, and found the ice solid and undisturbed the whole way across. No drag marks, no second set of tracks belonging to anyone or anything else, nothing to suggest he'd been carried off or had wandered further and left a trail too faint to follow. Ranger's tracks, by contrast, were everywhere, crossing and recrossing the creek a dozen times over, circling the spot where the boys' trail vanished, pacing the bank in a pattern that searchers read, correctly or not, as an animal looking for something it couldn't find. The dog's tracks came back to that same spot over and over. The boys never did. The search ran for the better part of 2 weeks, longer than anyone in the valley could remember a search running for anything, fueled as much by the unbearable strangeness of the boy's vanishing as by hope of finding him. Elias's father refused to quit long after most other men had quietly stopped believing there was anything left to find. He walked that creek bottom every day, in every kind of weather, calling his son's name in the woods that gave nothing back. Neighbors came from farms a half-day's ride off once word spread. Men who'd never met Elias, but came anyway, the way a valley turns out for a missing child regardless of how well anyone knew the family. They brought their own dogs to work the scent, animals that picked up Elias's trail readily enough at the house and along the familiar stretch of the trap line, only to lose it entirely at the same spot on the creek bank where his tracks had stopped, the same place Ranger refused to leave. They searched the timber on both sides for the better part of a mile. They broke ice and probed the deeper pools downstream, in case the boy had somehow gone through farther along and the current had carried him before the ice sealed over. They asked at every farm and cabin within walking distance, in case he'd wandered confused and frostbitten to some door other than his own. They found nothing, no body, no further tracks, no torn clothing caught on brush, no single fact that pointed in any direction at all. Winter deepened through the search rather than breaking, the ice on the creek growing thicker by the week, the snow piling deep enough in places to make further searching first difficult, and then, eventually, simply impossible. By the second week of the new year, the search had narrowed to a handful of men checking the same ground they'd already checked a dozen times, more out of loyalty to Elias's father than real hope, and by the third week, even that had thinned to almost nothing. Aaron kept walking the creek bottom alone long after the last neighbor had quietly stopped coming, some mornings doing little more than standing at the spot where the tracks had ended, looking at ground that had nothing left to tell him. He never said the words out loud, not to anyone, that he too had begun to accept what the rest of the valley had already accepted. He simply walked less far some days than others, stayed out a little less long, until even he couldn't have said exactly when his own searching had quietly become something closer to morning. Eventually, as gently as anyone in that valley knew how to manage it. People began speaking of Elias Whitfield the way they spoke of the dead. Not in those words exactly. Nobody was that unkind, but in the past tense, in the soft, careful language people use when hope has gone on too long without feeding itself and needs, for everyone's sake, to be allowed to rest. Only one member of that search refused to let it rest. Every morning, before the rest of the household was properly awake, Ranger left the house and walked the half-mile down to the creek bottom on his own, taking the same route he and Elias had always walked together, and settled himself on the bank at the exact spot where the boys' tracks had ended. He sat there through the morning. He sat there through the afternoon. As the light began to fail, he made his way home again, alone, the same way he'd come, and the next morning he did it again. Days became weeks. Weeks, as that hard winter ground on, became most of 2 months, with Ranger keeping the vigil through cold that would have driven a less stubborn animal indoors and kept him there. Elias's father tried, more than once, to break the habit. He called the dog home some mornings before he could slip away, kept him shut in the barn on the worst days, even drove him out to a cousin's farm 3 miles off for the better part of a week in the hope that distance and a change of scenery might loosen whatever held him to that spot on the creek. None of it worked. Ranger held the barn door until someone let him out. He slipped his rope twice in a single week, leaving frayed cord and a few strands of his own coat caught on the post where he'd worked himself free. At the cousin's farm, 3 miles off across country he'd never walked before, with 2 creek crossings and a stretch of timber between him and home, he was gone by the second morning, slipped out before anyone woke, with no trail anyone could follow well enough to say exactly how he'd managed it. He was found 3 hours later, sitting in his usual place on the creek bank, paws cut and bleeding from some stretch of rough ground along the way, soaked and shivering and utterly unmoved by the trouble he'd caused getting there, as though the distance had been nothing more than an inconvenience to be solved rather than an obstacle that could actually keep him away. Aaron Whitfield gave up trying to keep him elsewhere after that. He told a neighbor, not long after, that he'd come to feel it would be a kind of cruelty to keep fighting the dog on it, whatever the dog thought he was doing down there. If the waiting gave Ranger some purpose to hold on to through a winter that had taken his boy from him too, Aaron supposed there were worse things a grieving creature could do with its days. What struck people most, the longer it went on, was that the dog never waited anywhere else. Not at the house, not along any other stretch of the creek, upstream or down. Not at the spot where he himself had first been found, soaked and circling, the night of the storm. Only that one place, the exact patch of bank where the boys' tracks had stopped and never resumed, held him. Neighbors who passed that way took to watching for him, without quite meaning to, the way people watch for anything that has become, against their will, a fixture of the landscape. The dog sitting at the frozen creek became one of those things the valley simply lived around that winter, spoken of in low voices, never quite explained, never quite ignored either. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. A boy from a neighboring farm, a friend of Elias's from school, took to walking down some afternoons just to sit with Ranger a while, more for his own comfort than the dog's, he admitted later. He said the dog never seemed to mind the company, never moved from his spot regardless of who came or went, simply sat watching the frozen water with an attentiveness that unsettled the boy more the longer he stayed. He wasn't just sitting there, the boy said, years afterward. He was watching for something. You could tell. By the deepest part of February, theories about the dog had become almost as common as theories about the boy had been in the first weeks of the search. Most people settled on grief as the simplest explanation, the same instinct that made dogs wait at gravesides or refuse to leave a master's empty chair, stretched out now across a winter instead of a single afternoon. A dog didn't understand death the way a person did. This version held. He understood absence and presence and the difference between the two, and he was simply waiting the way a creature without words for loss will wait for a presence that wasn't coming back. It was a reasonable theory. It also failed, the longer the winter went on, to fully satisfy anyone who watched the dog closely enough. Grief in an animal usually softened with time, the edges of it wearing down the way grief did in people, the visits to an empty doghouse or a vacated chair growing less frequent as the months passed. Ranger's vigil showed no such softening. If anything, by the time the worst of February's cold set in, he seemed more fixed to that spot than he had in December. Not less, sitting through ice storms and bitter nights with a patience that looked less like mourning and more to more than one uneasy observer, like waiting for something specific to happen. An old trapper named Sutter, who'd worked that same stretch of creek bottom for the better part of 40 years before age slowed him down, came by more than once that winter just to watch the dog from a distance, the way he might watch any piece of animal behavior he didn't yet understand. He'd handled enough working dogs in his life to trust their instincts over most men's, and he said more than once that a dog that fixed and held on one exact piece of ground for that long, through that kind of cold, was telling you something about that ground whether you wanted to hear it or not. Dogs don't grieve in straight lines, the way we'd like to think, he told Aaron Whitfield one bitter afternoon, the two of them standing well back from where a ranger sat motionless at the bank. But they don't fix on a single patch of dirt for 2 months running, just because they're sad either. There's something pulling him to that spot. I don't know what it is. I don't think you do either. But I'd trust that animal's nose before I trust my own eyes. And I've looked at that creek 100 times and seen nothing worth looking at twice. There was one evening, late in February, when Ranger broke his silence. Aaron had walked down at dusk to bring him in, the way he sometimes did when the cold ran especially deep, and found the dog on his feet rather than seated, facing the far bank with his whole body rigid, barking, 3 short, sharp barks, the kind a dog gives when it's seen or heard something it wants a person to notice. Aaron followed the dog's line of sight across the frozen water and saw nothing. No movement in the timber, no shape against the snow, nothing but the same empty far bank that had given up nothing in 2 months of looking. Ranger barked once more, and then fell silent and sat back down in his usual place, as though the moment had simply passed through him and gone. He never did it again. Not that week. Not in all the weeks that followed, no matter how many evenings Aaron stood beside him afterward half hoping to hear it. Aaron asked Sutter about it the next time he came by, and the old trapper only shrugged and said a dog barked at all manner of things a man couldn't account for. A deer slipping through the timber, a branch giving way under snow load, nothing at all. He said it without much conviction, the way a man says something he doesn't fully believe because it's the only explanation available to him. The blizzard that struck in the first week of March was the last hard storm of that winter, though nobody knew it at the time, only that it was fierce enough to keep every soul in the valley indoors for the better part of 2 days, the wind driving snow sideways with a force that buried fence lines and made the creek bottom impassable even for a man determined to reach it. When the weather finally broke, Elias's father went down to the creek himself, as he had nearly every day since the search ended, more from habit and grief than any real expectation of finding Ranger there in conditions like that. He found the dog exactly where he always was, alive and apparently unharmed despite 2 days buried in weather that should have driven any sensible animal to shelter. Beside Ranger's tracks in the fresh snow, plain and unmistakable in the early light, ran a second set of tracks. A single set, boot-sized, leading down toward the creek bank from the tree line and stopping at almost the same spot where the dog kept his vigil, before turning and heading back into the timber the way they'd come. Aaron Whitfield stood over those tracks a long time before he trusted himself to move. He had spent 2 months teaching himself, carefully and deliberately, not to hope, had built that discipline the way a man builds any defense against a thing too painful to feel twice. Standing there in the cold morning light, looking at a boot print he could not explain and could not dismiss, he felt that discipline give way all at once. For one night, he let himself believe his son was alive and close, perhaps watching the farm even now from some hidden vantage in the timber, working up the courage or the strength to finally come home. He barely slept. He sat up by the window most of that night with a lamp burning, the way he hadn't done since the earliest days of the search, in case a boy who'd been afraid to be seen by daylight might risk the dark instead. Nobody could account for the tracks, in any way Aaron could carry forward into the daylight that followed. The storm had been bad enough that no searcher, no neighbor, no traveler passing through had been out in that country in 2 full days. Elias's father followed the tracks himself as far as the timber, where the snow beneath the trees had been disturbed enough by wind and falling branches to lose the trail entirely within 100 yards. He went back the next day with 2 neighbors and covered the same ground again, and again lost the tracks at the same place, the timber giving up nothing further, no matter how carefully they searched it. One of the neighbors, a man with some experience reading sign from years of trapping his own line, measured the boot prints as carefully as the fresh snow allowed before wind and thaw could blur them further. They were close in size to a grown man's boot, though slightly narrower, and spaced in a stride that suggested someone moving with purpose rather than wandering lost. He couldn't say more than that with any confidence. The snow hadn't held the print well enough for finer detail, and by the time he'd finished measuring, a thin new fall had already begun softening the edges of what remained. Word of the tracks spread through the valley within the day, and for a brief stretch that March, hope flared up again in a way it hadn't since the earliest days of the search. Hope that someone, perhaps even Elias himself, grown thin and changed by 2 months alone in hard country, had finally been seen, however briefly, however unexplainably. The hope didn't survive long. No further sign turned up in the days that followed. No second sighting. Nothing more than that one set of prints leading down to the creek bank and back in a timber that swallowed them whole. The hope didn't last past that one sleepless night. By the second morning, with no further sign and the tracks themselves already softening under a new dusting of snow, Aaron had begun the slow work of setting the hope back down again, the way he'd had to do once already, months before. A neighbor who saw him in the days that followed said he looked like a man walking on ice that might or might not hold his weight, careful, hollowed out, unwilling to trust the ground under him. He never spoke much about that night afterward. A few people who knew him said he was never again quite as fully resigned as he'd been in the weeks right before the blizzard. The tracks had cracked something open in him that 2 months of waiting had not managed to do. One morning after a blizzard, fresh tracks had appeared beside the dogs. Only one set. Nobody ever learned where they came from or where they went. Spring came late that year, the thaw holding off through most of March before finally breaking in the first warm week of April, the creek rising fast and loud with snowmelt after months locked under ice thick enough to walk on. It was during that thaw, with the water finally dropping back to its ordinary level after the first surge of melt had passed through, that a neighbor working the bank below the old crossing point noticed something the receding water had uncovered. Tucked beneath a low rock overhang on the creek's far side, hidden from view by the high water and by a tangle of brush that had grown thick across its mouth over years of neglect, ran a narrow channel beneath the bank itself. An old trapper's crossing, the kind cut into a creek banked generations back by men who'd wanted a way across that didn't depend on ice or a ford, low enough that a grown man would have to stoop to pass through it, but wide enough, easily, for a boy. Sutter, when he heard about it, said he half remembered the crossing from his own younger years working that line, a feature so old and so thoroughly grown over that he'd assumed, like most men in the valley, that it had collapsed or silted shut decades back. Nobody currently working that creek bottom had known it was still passable. Elias might have known it himself only by accident, or by some half-remembered story passed down the same way most old trapping lore got passed down in that country. A thing mentioned once by an older man and tucked away in a boy's memory without much weight given to it, until the night it mattered more than anything else he'd ever been told. Word reached Elias's father within the hour. He was at the crossing himself before the afternoon was out, working through brush that hadn't been cleared in years, and what he found inside changed the shape of everything the valley had believed about that winter. Ranger came with him, the way Ranger came everywhere that winter, and the dog's behavior at the mouth of that crossing struck the men who were there as the strangest thing they'd seen in 2 months of strange things. He didn't bark. He didn't dig or paw at the brush the way a dog excited by a fresh scent might. He simply sat at the entrance, very still, and watched Aaron Whitfield disappear into the dark beneath the overhang. The same patient, watchful stillness he'd shown every day at the creek bank, as though this, finally, was the thing he'd been waiting 2 months to see someone else find. There were signs that someone had sheltered in that narrow space. Not for one night, but for some considerable stretch of time afterward. A crude bed of dried grass and bark, gone flat and gray with age, but unmistakably arranged rather than simply fallen there. The charred remains of small fires, several of them, built far enough back under the overhang that the smoke would have drawn out through a natural gap in the rock rather than choking whoever sat there. And carved into the soft stone of the overhang's inner wall, low down near where a boy sitting would have had it at eye level, a single set of initials, EW, scratched deep enough to have survived a full winter under that rock. It explained nothing fully. It explained, instead, exactly enough to reopen every question the valley had thought closed. Elias's father found the knife 2 days later, working back through the crossing a second time with more care than the first frantic search had allowed. It was wedged into a crack near the back of the space, half buried in the dried grass of what had clearly served as a bed. His son's pocket knife, the one Elias had carried on the trap line every day of his life. The bone handle worn smooth from years in a boy's pocket. A knife his father could have picked out of 100 others without a second's hesitation. He remembered, holding it, the morning he'd given it to the boy, Elias's 10th birthday, the knife a hand-me-down from Aaron's own father before him, already worn smooth even then. He remembered telling him to take care of it, the way a father tells a son to take care of anything meant to outlast him. The boy had taken care of it. That much, at least, the knife itself made plain. The blade still held a working edge. The hinge still moved clean and tight, kept up the way Elias kept up everything entrusted to him. He sat with that knife in his hand a long while before he could bring himself to leave the crossing, turning it over and over, trying to read in its presence some fact he could carry home and hold on to. The knife told him his son had been here. It told him, by the fires and the bed and the carved initials, that Elias had survived the night of the storm, had found this hidden crossing and sheltered in it, perhaps for days, perhaps for weeks. There was no way to know for certain how long, only that it had been longer than one night, longer than anyone searching that winter had dared to hope. What it didn't tell him, what nothing in that crossing told him, was what had happened after. Whether the boy had grown too weak to go further, whether he tried to make his way home and lost his bearings in another storm, whether he was, even now, somewhere beyond that crossing that no search had yet reached. The knife was evidence of survival, not of an ending. It left the question open in the cruelest possible way, proof that hope hadn't been foolish, without ever quite rewarding it. Word of the crossing and what it held moved through the valley with a different weight than the disappearance itself had carried, months before. People who had quietly made their peace with the closed question now found that peace undone, and not everyone was grateful for it. A few said as much, gently, to Aaron Whitfield, that perhaps it would have been kinder, in the end, to let the winter's verdict stand rather than reopen a wound that had only just begun to close. Aaron didn't argue the point. He only said that he hadn't asked for the crossing to be found, and wouldn't have traded the knowing for anything, however the knowing happened to sit in his chest some mornings. The dog, Elias's father came to believe, had been right all along. Not about an outcome, only about a place. Whatever instinct or memory or simple stubborn loyalty had held Ranger to that one spot on the creek bank through an entire winter, it had been pointing, however imperfectly, at something real. Ranger stopped going to the creek the same week the crossing was found. There was no announcement in it, no dramatic final visit or obvious moment of release. Elias's father simply noticed, some days later, that the dog hadn't slipped away at first light the way he had nearly every morning for 2 months. He stayed in the yard instead, underfoot through the morning chores the way an ordinary dog might. And when evening came he was still there, settled by the porch steps, showing no inclination at all to make the walk he'd made without fail through the worst of that winter. Aaron Whitfield found himself watching the dog those first few mornings the way he'd once watched the creek bank, half expecting the old habit to reassert itself, some particular slant of light or change in weather that would send Ranger trotting back down the lane out of pure, stubborn memory. It never happened. The dog took up an ordinary dog's life with a thoroughness that struck Aaron as its own kind of strange, following him through the spring planting, sleeping by the hearth at night, behaving in every visible way like an animal who had simply set down a weight he'd been carrying and found, underneath it, an unremarkable life waiting to be picked back up. He never went back. Not the next day, not the day after, not once in all the years that followed. Whatever had held him to that spot on the creek bank for 2 long winter months had, it seemed, simply finished holding him, in its own time, on its own terms, the same quiet way it had begun. People in the valley argued about it for years afterward, the way they argued about most things from that winter that never received a clean answer. Some in the valley settled on the simplest explanation, the one that needed nothing from a dog's understanding beyond what any dog naturally carried. That Ranger had smelled something on the wind off that creek bank no human searcher could have detected, some trace of smoke or scent drifting down from the hidden crossing across the water, faint enough to escape every man who walked that bank, but plain enough to a nose built for exactly that kind of work. It was a tidy theory. It also failed to explain why the dog had fixed on that one spot from the very first night, weeks before any fire had been lit in the crossing at all, if there had been a fire lit there that first night to begin with. Others thought it was simpler still, plain animal grief, the same instinct that made dogs wait at gravesides or refuse an empty chair, stretched out across 2 months instead of an afternoon because a dog had no calendar to tell him when waiting had gone on too long. The crossing, in this telling, was nothing more than an unrelated discovery that happened to lend the waiting a meaning it had never actually possessed. Grief didn't need a hidden shelter to explain itself. It only needed an absence and a creature that loved what was missing. A smaller number, mostly the older trappers who'd spent enough years reading creek bottoms to trust an animal's sense of ground over their own, believed something plainer and harder to dismiss. That the dog had understood something about that stretch of water no person looking with human eyes had ever managed to see, and that 2 months of patient watching had been, in its own way, more thorough than anything 2 weeks of human searching had accomplished. Nobody ever proved any version of it. Aaron Whitfield, who thought about little else for the rest of his life, said only that he didn't know how to explain a dog who waited 2 months in one exact spot and then simply stopped the same week a hidden crossing was found 30 yards from where he sat, but that he'd stopped expecting a clean explanation somewhere around the day he found his son's knife and had made what peace with that he could. Old-timers, telling the story years later, tended to settle on the one line that captured what the rest of the explanations couldn't quite manage. That the dog waited there longer than any man would have, through worse weather than any man would have stood for, and that whatever he'd been waiting for, he'd known, somehow, exactly when to stop. Aaron Whitfield stayed on at the farm until his own death, years later, never remarrying, the place eventually passing to a nephew who had little memory of that winter beyond what his elders had told him secondhand. Ranger lived out his years there too, an ordinary farm dog by every visible measure, well-loved and well-fed, showing no trace in his later seasons of the 2 months he'd spent refusing to leave a frozen creek bank for anything the world tried to offer him instead. The creek still runs through that stretch of bottomland every spring, rising fast with a thaw the same as it always has. The old crossing beneath the overhang has long since grown back over with brush, the way most things in that country eventually do. And some winters, when the ice sets in hard enough to walk on, an old-timer passing that way will pause a moment at the bank and think of a dog who waited there until spring came and never said why.